So George, what are the post-production software programs that photographers should be looking at to make better images?
Well, there's a lot of them, Struan. They basically start from offerings that are free. For example, Apple, with all of their computers, they provide you with a copy of iPhoto. And it's a great program. It allows you to get started and do a lot of basic traditional edits, you know, making your picture brighter, making it darker, that sort of thing. But when it comes to performing edits in specific little areas of your image. If, for example, if you only want to touch up somebody's, say, maybe wrinkles, blemishes on their skin, then you need something with a little bit more power, something a little bit more sophisticated. And that's where a program like Photoshop Elements comes into play. Photoshop Elements is the little brother to the industry gold standard, as most of us have heard of Photoshop. Photoshop Elements gives a lot of people the opportunity to do some amazing things with their photographs. Photoshop, its bigger brother, I would sort of label it as an industrial strength tool. And if one were to sort of have professional aspirations in design or entering the professional photographic world, you'd eventually need to know that program. Right. Now, in addition to those would be what I would call the traditional editors. There's sort of like a new breed that's come up, and the new breed of software, two examples would be Lightroom and Aperture from Apple. And these programs are new because they're kind of like database programs, and they give us a whole new level of flexibility. They do everything for us. I like to call them project managers. They allow us to manage our photographs, edit them, and to also publish them too. If we want to output them, print them, create slideshows, photo galleries, things like that. So
now when I'm talking to photographers or when I get asked by emerging talent about when to use the software, obviously my first reply is, why don't you get it right in the camera first and then start using some of the software at a later date? When does the photographer start using, or when should they start using this kind of post-production programming?
So I think you made a really, really strong point there. Getting it right in the camera, I think, is hugely important, because if we do a good job in camera, then we have more options later on when it comes to enhancing the image later on. You know, I'll never forget Ansel Adams and his old saying. The original, or in his case, the negative, was the composer's music score, and then his darkroom work, or his prints, they were the orchestra's performance. And I think that still applies today. We can do a great job in camera, but we usually need that finishing touch. Photographs are always about sort of conveying a little bit of emotion, whatever it may be. And you know, sometimes some images just need that little kiss of contrast, or a little bit of a color saturation, or reverse. And that's when we need our software. So I think it's pretty much from the get-go. It's pretty much from the start that we need to be somewhat comfortable with an editing solution.
So George, with all this post-production software, what are the pros and cons of each of these elements, from Aperture to iPhoto, or Photo Elements, or Lightroom?
Sure. At the introductory level, of course, the software programs are designed with the new user in mind. So they're basically, generally speaking, a lot easier to use than most of the other programs. Very quick one-click solutions, so to speak. You might see functions like enhance. So you click on an enhance button, and it does a whole bunch of things to try to get the picture right. Great way to start. It allows you to save a lot of time, of course, but eventually you get to a point where the picture needs a little bit more. It needs a little bit more attention, a little bit more love. You might have a picture of somebody with a blemish on their skin. Maybe it's an older person and you don't want to get rid of all the wrinkles, you just want to de-emphasize them. When you need more flexibility as well, when you need more flexibility, the ability to change your mind on certain things, that's when you really need to step up.
So the control over some of the software.
That's right. Yeah. Control and flexibility, that's a really big thing when it comes to software.
So let's move up to the big names like Aperture and Lightroom. What do they do for us?
I mentioned a little bit earlier that I like to call them the new kids on the block. Part of the reason why is because when we edit with those programs, we're not actually touching the pixels of our original image. We're not bruising them whatsoever. When we edit with those programs, it might look like we're modifying our picture, but really what's going on behind the scenes is we're just creating a recipe which tells the computer to show us what the image will look like with that recipe applied. And it's only at the moment when we want to print or for whatever reason export the image out of the program that we actually sort of bake the cake, so to speak. We take our ingredients and our recipe, we put it in the oven, and now it becomes a TIFF file, a PSD, all of those sort of permanent, regular, standard type formats.
So it doesn't damage the raw file there, it's always there to go back to and do whatever else you want to do with it.
That's right. Yeah. It never damages the photo, and it gives us a level of flexibility to change our mind that we hadn't seen before, the creation of these programs. So they're quite special, and they're getting a lot of attention these days.
So George, now that we have several programs that we've talked about, what are the price points on each of these, and what's a good entry level for a beginning photographer or
Sure.
an aspiring photographer?
Sure. As we mentioned before, iPhoto comes with every Mac for free, so there's no added cost there. But again, if you're aspiring to obtain a little bit more control, Photoshop Elements will typically be around $100 to $130, more or less.
So George, talking about Aperture and Lightroom, what are the price points on these programs, and what would you suggest for an aspiring photographer?
Sure. Aperture is a little bit more economical than Lightroom. The one, of course, disadvantage is that it's only available on the Apple platform. Aperture these days is around $200, and going up to Lightroom, we're looking at somewhere between $300 and $400. In terms of what I would advise, what I would recommend for an aspiring enthusiast, if you're on a Macintosh, I would go with Aperture because it's certainly at the price point it is a bit of a better value. And then I would also throw in a little partner. I would throw Photoshop Elements into the mix because Photoshop Elements, although Aperture is sufficient on its own for basic edits and many, many spot edits, when it comes to real fine retouching, if you start to get more serious with portraiture, Photoshop Elements will allow you to finish the job in a real classy way. So I'd recommend having Photoshop Elements as part of the pair. If you're on a Windows computer, of course, Aperture is not available for Windows, so in that case, Lightroom is your man.
There's your solution there.
That's right.